Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today we'll be doing a full in-depth guide on Sylas. In case you're new to the channel, I'm a multi-rank 1 challenger mid laner and I also play pro play for around 4.5 years. Sylas is one of the absolute best champions to play for solo queue because he can carry and snowball games extremely easily, and he's also not too difficult to play, so he's definitely a champion that I would consider adding to your champion pool if you haven't added him already. Starting out with Sylas's runes, there's pretty much only 2 pages you need to think about, and that is the Conqueror page and the First Strike page. So Conqueror is definitely your standard. Conqueror is extremely good on Sylas because it synergizes really well with his trading pattern. He likes a lot of extended trades and he can stack Conqueror reasonably quickly. So when you're going this, obviously we take Conqueror and then we'll be going Presence of Mind. You really do need the mana. It allows you to take those extended fights, and the longer fights are, the better for Sylas. The other two, they just aren't that great. I mean, Triumph is decent, but you just kind of run into mana problems. Legend Tenacity, pretty obvious. Attack Speed or Bloodline aren't that great. Like, you could take Attack Speed. This is something that people used to do just to make it feel a bit smoother, but I think Tenacity is a lot better. This gives you so much Tenacity for free, and one of Sylas's biggest weaknesses is getting killed before he can get his cooldowns off. So as long as you can kind of keep alive and keep your cooldowns coming out, it's very valuable. So I really recommend Tenacity. Here, I would say Last Stand. You could also go one of these if you wanted, but I think Last Stand is the most consistent. Now, for your secondaries, you can take quite a few different things. I would recommend taking Resolve, and you can kind of mix and match here with what you want. So, for example, if you're against a poke lane, you might take Second Wind. All-in lanes, Bone Plating can be good. Obviously, Conditioning is really good for scaling. If you want more tenacity, you can go Unflinching. Overgrowth or Revitalize can both be pretty nice. So there is quite a lot of choice for you here, and they're all pretty decent. If you want to get a bit greedier, you can go the Inspiration Tree, and in here I would recommend taking Magical Boots and Cosmic. I think Time Warp Tonic used to be really good, but after the nerf is not so great, but I think Magical Boots and Cosmic is a very greedy style that you can go for. You'll get your first item quite a bit quicker with Magical Boots, and also Summoner cooldown is very nice on Sylas. Another greedier thing you can do is if you just want to play for your laning phase, you could go something like Mana Flow Scorch. You can get a lot of extra poke off with this, or you can even go Mana Flow Transcendence for a little bit of extra CDR. So there is a lot of different things you can do, but I really do think that the Resolve secondary is the most consistent overall, and you basically just take whatever you need here based on the kind of matchup and team comp you're against. For your secondaries, you can take Ability Haste or Adaptive Force. I don't think you really need Attack Speed, but if you really struggle with CSing, you could probably take it. But I think that Ability Haste obviously scales really well, and Adaptive Force is pretty nice for helping you in early skirmishes, so this is really up to you. I kind of prefer the Adaptive Force a lot of the time, but if you do think you can just scale for free, Ability Haste is just really nice in Sylas. Other than that, we're just taking Adaptive Force here, and then Armor or MR depending on the matchup. The other page that's really good on Sylas is the First Strike page. So this is really good if you're in a easy or really free matchup, because it'll just allow you to get yourself so much extra gold. So you would take First Strike, Magical Boots, could go Stopwatch if you want, but I think Boots are better. Here, you can kind of take whatever you want. Futures Market could be good if you're trying to rush out Lost Chapter. Otherwise, Biscuits or DMAT are both fine. Cosmic, though, should be the one you take here for sure. It's super good, especially if you're in a winning lane and can get away with a bit more greed. Now, for your secondaries, I would say you can still mix and match with the exact same things as before. However, because you're most likely taking a First Strike in a lane that's really easy for you, I would actually recommend taking Mana Flow in Scorch or even Transcendence in Scorch and just looking to snowball that lane even more. I also think that the Adaptive Force instead of Ability Haste could probably be better. I really think this is like ideal for killing your opponent, you know, putting yourself ahead, trying to get towards your one item spikes even quicker than normal. So I would recommend running these together, but again, if you do for some reason run First Strike with Resolve, that's fine as well. Next, we have Sylas's items. So for your starting items, you do have a few options. Now, if you're not sure, I would say start with Doran Shield. This should be your standard in most matchups. Sylas, he doesn't have the strongest early game, so having extra early game sustain is really nice. And because most mid laners will be looking to take pretty big advantage of Sylas in those first few levels, especially the first 3. Having the Doran Shield for extra sustain is really nice. So this should be your go-to if you're in an even or difficult matchup. Now, if you're in an even matchup, but it's actually a melee matchup, I would probably start Corrupting Potion instead. That's going to be because they're probably not going to be proccing your Doran Shield passive too much, and instead you're going to get more sustain out of this. Now, if you're in a difficult melee matchup, I would still start with the Doran Shield just because you're probably not going to be walking up wanting to trade too much, but if you're in an even melee matchup, then Corrupting Pot is your best bet. If you're in an easy or free matchup, you can look to start with the Doran's Ring 2 potions. This gives you a lot of offensive power and so if you're in a winning matchup, can help you snowball a lot. But just keep in mind that Sylas's weakest point is in that early laning phase, so don't feel bad about starting with a little bit of extra sustain, because normally that's the only time you can really be taken advantage of. So don't be too greedy with it, but if you get a good matchup, you can look to extend your lead with this. Moving over to early buys, we have a lot of choices here. So the first one is refillable potion. If you didn't start corrupting potion, you should probably look to pick up a refillable potion on one of your first bases. It's extremely cheap, gives you a lot of extra HP, and as a melee champion, you're going to be taking a lot of damage just from harass, and also because any time that you trade with your opponent, you're going to have to be right on top of them. So I think refillable, obviously don't end your base for it. You know, if you can get something like Lost Chapter, definitely don't give that up to buy refillable, but if you ever get a time to buy refillable, you definitely should. Darksteel, it's kind of a similar thing. You should be buying this most games. Darksteel is just extremely good for snowballing on any AP champion. And Sylas, he really wants to skirmish and fight a lot, so you will be getting a lot of stacks as long as you're not dying too often. So I would recommend trying to pick this up before your first item pretty much every single game. Boots are also really good to pick up, especially in mid lane. They help you against skill shots, and also as a melee champion, they can help with chasing people down or just closing the gap for trades. So they're really, really good for only 300 gold. The item you're trying to get the most in the early game is your Lost Chapter. It's unlikely that you have enough gold to buy this most of the time, but if you do, you should straight up buy it. It gives you infinite mana, and you'll be able to start really taking over your lane, and it also allows you to start wave clearing and roaming a bit more. Sylas doesn't have the greatest mana cost very early in the game, but once you get a Lost Chapter, most of those are pretty much solved. After that, we have some defensive choices, and they mainly depend on what item you're building and also what kind of matchup you're in. So generally what I would say is that if you just want an all-purpose defensive item, Kindle Gem is really good, but this requires you to be building a mythic that builds out of Kindle Gem, so either Crown or Everfrost. You also build Leandries sometimes on Sylas, as we're going to talk about. So if you're building Leandries, you wouldn't want Kindle Gem, and you would instead want something else. So those something else's can be Seeker's Armguard is pretty good in AD matchups, so if you're against a champion that has like really strong auto attack damage, we're thinking champions like Lucian, Akshan, you can look for this. You could even consider Ninja Tabi in those matchups if you really needed it, but I think Seeker's Armguard is probably just better, especially because Sylas normally builds Azonias. Merc Treads is really good against double AP mid jungles, or if you're against a mid with a lot of CC and AP. One thing I always bring up is it's not worth buying Merc Treads just for the MR. You have to also be getting value out of either the movement speed or the tenacity, because you can get 25 magic resist for only 450 gold anyway. So basically, if they have a lot of CC either on their mid or their jungle or both, you can grab Merc Treads. So it's really good against champions like Syndra, champions like Zoe, or mid jungles like Lysandra, Elise, Zac, just any kind of mid jungle that between them have some AP and some CC. Merc Treads are very valuable against. You can also just pick up Lucidity Boots early. Lucidity Boots are fairly cheap, and they're a really solid purchase on Sylas, as we're about to talk about in the boot option. So this can be good if you just can't really afford a bigger ticket item and you also don't need any defensive stats. You can just look for Lucidity as kind of a midway point between an offensive option and a defensive option. Sylas's boot option. So Sylas is interesting because he's one of the few mid laners that actually just prefers Lucidity Boots to Sork Shoes. Ability Haste is just actually amazing on Sylas. It plays into just everything he wants to do. He just wants to get more and more cooldowns off during the fight. And also just because of the way his W works, this also translates into more survivability a lot of the time, because you're going to get extra Ws off. So your standard choice would definitely be Lucidity Boot. As we said before, if you're against a team where you need magic resist and tenacity, then Merc Treads are a really, really good option. Now you should be kind of careful with buying this, just because if you're already running like a Conqueror Resolve page, you have a lot of tenacity already from Legend Tenacity and Unflinching, so you might not even need Merc Treads, especially if they don't have AP damage as well. That being said, if they have so much CC that you still want more tenacity, you definitely can go for it, but it does have some kind of diminishing returns, so just keep that in mind when you're buying it. As we said before, Sork Shoes are kind of interesting because most of the time you're just going to want Lucidity Boots. That being said, if for some reason you feel like the fight is just going to be over way quicker, it's not going to be about getting lots of cooldowns off, and instead just going to be a lot about burst, or you're just a solo AP on your team and they have like literally no magic resist, you could look for Sork Shoes instead. That being said, I think if you're not sure, just go Lucidity Boots, but Sork Shoes still have a place as well. On to Sylas's standard build. So for your first item, you'll be picking up your mythic of choice. That will most likely be Everfrost. This is obviously just really good, gives ability haste, gives HP, also the root is quite nice, so has a lot of the things that Sylas wants, and you'll definitely be wanting to pick it up first. You will also be wanting to pick up your boots of choice very early in the game, and a lot of the time you will be wanting to complete your boots before your Everfrost just because they're very cheap and they're really easy to work into your buys. So it's very common that you might have something like Lost Chapter, Tier 2 boots, and then finish your Everfrost. Or, if you can just buy your full Everfrost and get boots second as well, that's fine. It's basically just like you want to get these two items here, your mythic and your boots, pretty much as early as you can, and you spike insanely hard off just these spikes alone. Sylas's second and third core items are pretty situational, and we will talk about that a bit more down here, but I think for the most part, if you're going like Zhonya's second Cosmic third or Cosmic second Zhonya's third, both of those are really solid for your core items. It's quite difficult to go into these heavy AP items as early as other mages do, just because Sylas is a melee champion, so he kind of needs extra either defensive stats or extra ability haste, something that's just going to allow him to stay alive in those fights longer. Sylas is a lot about just getting off as many rotations of cooldowns in a team fight as you can. So actives like Zhonya's obviously buy you a lot of extra time. Cosmic gives you HP, gives you a lot of ability haste. So these are really solid items. Again, can be replaced by situational items here as well. After that, you will be looking to round out your build with Rabadons and Void in whichever order you need them. So if they have a lot of magic resist, you can grab your Void stuff first for the % magic pen. If they don't have much magic resist, you can just go Rabadons. You'll have a lot of AP by that point, so it'll scale really, really nicely. But basically, by the time you're that deep in your build, Rabadons and Void just get you so much value, and you pretty much should almost never have a 6-item build without these 2 items in it, although sometimes there's an argument for giving up Void in favor of something else if they have literally no MR. For your alternative mythics, there are only 2 really good choices, which are Liandry's and Crown. So Liandry's is really good against tankier teams because of the health burn, and also because you don't need the HP as much against tankier teams, because typically tankier teams don't burst you down, which is a lot of like what the Everfrost health is meant to stop from happening. So if you can get away with Liandry's, it is like much higher damage, but you shouldn't be buying it unless the enemy team has quite a lot of health stackers, and also that you're pretty confident that you're not going to die very, very early in the fight. Crown is very similar to Everfrost in that it gives you a lot of the stats you need in order to survive, but it has a bit more of a specialized role. So the Crown shield is particularly useful if you know your shield is not going to get popped by the time you're engaging. So what this basically means is you don't want to buy this against longer range comps, because you're almost always going to lose your shield before you are able to engage into the enemy team comp. So it's very, very good against short range compositions if they have a lot of melees that are somewhat squishy. So there's like a little bit of overlap between Liandry's and Crown. I do think it is really good if you're worried about dying extremely early into the fight. Like for example, maybe they have a lot of initial burst, but they don't have anything else to follow it up with. So I think most of the time you can just go Everfrost instead, but Crown does exist as like a very special solution to the very special problem of just being like instantly one shot on the engage. Lastly, we have situational items. So for Medjai's, what I normally say is if you get 8 or more stacks on a Dark Seal, just go ahead and upgrade it into a Medjai's. I think on Sylas you should be a bit more cautious, just because you're a melee champion, you'll be kind of in the middle of the fight a lot of the time, which makes it much easier to die if you make a mistake. So I think you should be very careful about when you buy Medjai's. It is obviously still really good for snowballing. Just make sure you're pretty confident that you're not going to die. Shadow Flame is interesting. I've seen a few people build this on Sylas. Personally, I'm not a huge fan. I don't think it really plays into what Sylas wants to do of getting lots of cooldowns off. It is more burst oriented. I think that you can consider it if you're the solo AP in your team as kind of a second item option, but I wouldn't really consider it beyond that. And personally, I don't think it's that great, but it is something you can think about. Lichbane is quite interesting. So it has a couple different places in the build. One way you can use it is as a greedier option. So you might have something like, say, Cosmic second and then Lichbane third. If you feel like you really don't need a Zhonya's, it can give you a lot of damage. You might also find it to be quite useful as a last item if you really don't need Void stuff, if they don't have any MR. Otherwise, I think Lichbane is kind of outshone by other items. It's not really a great second item, but it can be a good third or last item. Sylas is pretty decent at applying healing reduction, so Oblivion Orb is kind of nice, but at the same time, these items don't give any ability haste. So I think if you really need healing reduction, you can buy an Oblivion Orb. I wouldn't upgrade it into Morello, and I think if you can avoid buying Healing Cup and you have someone else on your team buy it, it is probably better. But if like you really need Healing Cup, they have so much healing and your team just isn't buying any, then you can buy an Oblivion Orb. The next 3 items are somewhat situational, but they will end up in most of your builds. So as we said before, Zhonya's Cosmic, pretty standard. But in reality, like Zhonya's Banshees and Cosmic are all very standard options, and you can pick up basically whichever ones of them you need. So if, for example, you need a lot of tankiness, you could go Zhonya's and Banshees before going Rabadon's Void. If you wanted something really aggressive, we could go Cosmic Lichbane into our Rabadon's Void. If we wanted something in between, we could go, say, Cosmic and then Zhonya's. We could go Zhonya's and then Cosmic. We could do Banshees with Cosmic. You know, we don't always need a Zhonya's. So basically what I'm saying is the rest of these items here are situational and will be picked up some of the time, but you will most games be picking up some variant of Zhonya's, Banshees, or Cosmic, or, you know, some combination of those depending on what you need. So basically Banshees, good tankiness against AP. Zhonya's really good for the active and for armor. Cosmic obviously gives a lot of HP, also gives ability haste. Demonic Embrace is an extremely strong niche item, so it's really, really good against tankier teams, especially when you combine it with Liandry's. So I would never go Demonic without Liandry's, but if you're going Liandry's against a tankier team, you could pick up Demonic as your second or third item, combined with pretty much whatever you want out of, you know, our other standard or our other situational items before continuing on to the rest of your standard build. Sums on Sylas are really straightforward. You're just going to be taking either Flash TP or Flash Ignite. Flash is obviously very good for making aggressive plays, getting out of ganks and stuff like that. It's just a very overpowered sum. Now, most of the time you will be wanting to take TP. The reason for this is that Sylas, again, is quite weak in those very first few levels, and having TP to get a free base during that time is really, really nice. And also teleport can be pretty nice in the mid game because you can side lane fairly well and then TP to a lot of skirmishes. So I really recommend TP. You can take Ignite in a really free matchup to help you snowball even more, but there aren't that many matchups for Sylas where you just destroy them even in the early game. So I would recommend Flash TP as your standard, but Flash Ignite does have some uses as well. Moving on to Sylas's abilities. First off, we have the passive. So after using an ability, you gain a charge, and you can stack this up to 3, max 3 charges. Sylas's attacks expend a charge to whirl his change, which deal damage, and also a little bit of extra AoE damage. You also get attack speed while you have a charge, just to make using this a bit easier. And on top of that, when empowered, your auto attacks execute low HP champions. So all this really means in reality is that after you use abilities, you can see you have a charge here that's going to make your next auto much faster and do a little bit of AoE damage as well. And like it says, you can stack this up to 3 times. So if you use a combo where you're using a lot of abilities, stacking these up, you can then follow it up with a bunch of auto attacks like this. Weaving in these auto attacks into your combos is going to be quite important as it adds up to a lot of extra damage. Sylas's Q is an interesting skill shot. The way it works, you lash your chains out, which deals damage and slows the target, and also the place where the chains intersect explodes, dealing a further amount of damage. And you can see most of the damage is loaded into that second detonation. So you can see here that when you cast it, this circle here where the chains intersect is that second explosion. And it's really important that you use the slow on this to try and hit that second detonation, because like I just said, that's where all the damage comes from. So for example, you could slow the target and they wouldn't be able to move out of it. So aiming this ability is quite important, as well as timing it when your opponent goes to CS or is otherwise locked in an animation. Sylas's W is very simple. It's a point and click ability which deals damage, as you can see here. Against champions, you also restore additional HP based on your missing health, with getting your max healing when Sylas is at or below 40% health. So this is a very good trading tool because it deals damage and returns HP. Also, the fact that it's point and click is very nice because they're never going to be able to dodge it unless they're out of your range. Now, quickly worth noting is this actually counts as a dash, which means you can't use it while you're rooted and you can't use it while you're grounded. So that's just kind of good to keep in mind, because there will be some times when you might be relying on this to come up. And you won't be able to use it because of one of those reasons. Sylas's E has 2 parts to it, which we will call E1 and E2. So the first part of it, you just quickly dash, and you can use this to go over walls and stuff as well. You can see here, just a short dash, and it prepares a recast for 3.5 seconds. So that's what we will call E2. And the way that works is you can then reactivate it to throw your chains, which pulls yourself to the first enemy hit. Doesn't just have to be a champion, can be the creeps, jungle camps, etc., which deals damage and knocks them up for a short amount of time. So as you can see here, you can dash and then you can throw your E and it'll knock them up, as well as do some damage. Finally, we have Sylas's R. So this is very simple. Basically, it's a point and click ability, and when you cast it on a champion, it steals their ult. So while I can't show you in practice tool, there will be an ulti tier list at the end of the video, which I would recommend checking out. So for which ability to max first on Sylas? Well, Sylas is one of the very few champions in this game that actually has different ability max orders depending on the situation. So I just want to kind of talk about what each ability, kind of like putting points in it, does for you. So putting points in Q is very good for the early game. It gives you a lot of poke, makes your laning phase a lot easier, and also gives you wave clear, because in the early game you kind of struggle with wave clear and you also struggle with farming. So basically Q is extremely good for the laning phase and for farming in the early game. W is really, really good for skirmishing. It makes it much harder for you to be killed in those early skirmishes, and also because it's undodgeable, unlike the other ones of Sylas's abilities, you will always get a lot of value out of it. So putting points in W is very good just for point and click, trades, although most of the time Q is better for trading, but in some matchups W can be quite good for trading. But yeah, mostly it's for those early game skirmishes. And then the E is, putting points in E is mainly good for burst. So you can see that putting points in E increases its damage by a huge amount. So a lot of people will put points in E if they're kind of confident the fights are going to be very short and they're not going to get a lot of uses out of their W. So with those things in mind, there's a few standard ability orders. The first off is just to max Q, max W, max E, and then put points in R whenever you're able to. I think this is the most standard and probably the best overall. If you're not sure what to max, just max Q, W, E, and put points in R whenever you're able to. The reason I like this is because, again, Sylas' lane is quite weak in the early game. Maxing Q makes farming so much easier and also makes laning a lot easier. And then obviously you have points for kind of the mid-game skirmishes that are going to start happening a lot in solo queue. And I think in solo queue, there aren't that many games where it's going to be really about burst, so you can max E last. Obviously, just putting points in all whenever you can is really, really good. Another thing you can do with this is you can actually do 3 points Q into W max, E max if you want. I kind of prefer putting 5 points in Q, but if you feel like skirmishes are going to start really early, you could do that as well. Another thing that's been done more in competitive is just maxing Q, maxing E, and then maxing W. So the reason I think this is better in competitive is because fights don't happen as often, and also they're a lot less scattered, and they're often decided very, very early. So Sylas in competitive don't often get those like prolonged fights that you get in solo queue. So that's like the QEW max. I don't really like this in solo queue, but if you really think the fights are going to be really short, really bursty, you could look for that as well. The last one I've seen people do is actually just maxing W, then E, then Q. And the reason for that is if you're maxing W first, for kind of like early skirmishing and some point and click trades, maybe against a melee champion, there's not much reason to put points in Q because remember, Q is mainly for the early game when you can't wave clear and when you have problems in the laning phase. So if you're maxing W first, you might as well max E second and then max Q last. I think that this isn't that good anymore. Like I said, I really prefer the Q max, but it is something you can do if you just think fights are going to happen all the time and if there are tons of melee champions. So to kind of summarize everything, because I think it is quite confusing, I would just recommend maxing Q, then W, then E, and obviously putting points in alt whenever you can. But if you were going to consider other ones, like they do exist, but I really think just stick to the standard Q, W, E because it simplifies a lot of what makes Sylas difficult. Like Sylas has kind of bad laning and putting points in Q makes that easier. He's also sort of hard to farm with, especially if you fall behind. Again, Q is really good at that. And in skirmishes, obviously putting points in W is a lot easier than playing with E because you don't even have to hit the skill shot. So I really think QWE is just the best. Sylas doesn't really have set combos. I think you really have to be kind of fluid with how you use them and you just kind of need to understand how the abilities work. That being said, in lane, there are a couple of different ways you can use your ability to trade. So the kind of obvious one is, especially if you're putting points in Q, when your opponent goes for a creep, it's very easy while they're locked in that auto animation to hit them with the slow and get the detonation on them, and that will do a ton of damage. So that's really good to look for in the laning phase. Another way you can trade is you can look for like an E auto, W auto, E2 auto. So as we said before, weaving autos in between your abilities is kind of important, but because it stacks to 3, if you feel like you can get the autos afterwards, you can do that as well. So like, for example, you could just E onto them, get 1 auto in W, and then you could just put 2 autos on them afterwards. So it doesn't really matter which way you do it, as long as you can kind of get all your autos off. Another thing you might want to consider is, do you want to use your Q early or late? So there's a couple advantages and disadvantages. The advantage to using Q first is that it slows them and it makes it easier to hit your E. So this can make it quite easy to follow up on them with the rest of your trade. It can make it easier for your jungler or someone to go for a gank, you know, because like while they're slowed, it's easier for them to hit their CC and it's also easier to hit yours. So it's really good for setting up and really good for initiating a trade. Another way you might want to use it is actually to use it after in order to keep chasing them. So for example, if you were opening up with E, you might want to Q them afterwards so that you can stick on them while they're slowed and actually get your auto attacks while they're running away. So this really depends if you're just going for kind of like a setup combo, like do you just want a short trade? Do you not want to chase them afterwards? Or are you trying to set up for your jungler? Another thing that I've seen some people like to do is they actually start with E1 to get in range, slow them, and then if it hits, they can then decide if they want to go for that E or not. That can be quite a good choice as well, because it doesn't mean, or it means that you don't have to fully commit to the trade until you're sure that that Q2 is going to hit. During your E2, while you're flying to your target, you can actually use your ult or you can use items. So this can be quite useful for taking the target's ult while you're in midair and just casting it on them as soon as you land. It can also be used, yeah, with Zhonya's, but I think most of the time you're just going to be looking to use the R. Unfortunately, you can't combo it with your Q. You can't actually cast Q while you're in the air, which is quite annoying. It actually used to be a thing, but they got rid of it. Once you get your Everfrost, it really simplifies your combos. Basically, you can just use Everfrost to help you hit your Q and E. Probably the best way to do it is just to E into them, Everfrost, hit Q, and then E them after. So that basically guarantees that you're going to hit all your damage, and you can just weave in a bunch of autos and stuff after that as well. If you only have some of your cooldowns up, like for example, you don't have E, you can actually just like Everfrost them first and then Q them off it, and then when your E comes up, you know, you can look to chase them with it. So there's a lot of ways you can do it, but basically Everfrost is just super easy to allow you to hit all these other cooldowns. The very last thing, there are a couple things you can do with Flash. Obviously, if you steal an ultimate that is like normally Flash ultable, so for example, Cassio ult, that works fine on Sylas as well. And the other thing is you can actually buffer your W and then Flash and have it instantly go off. So for example, when you cast W on someone, you can see your character starts walking towards them. So as long as you flash within the W range, like as long as you're close enough to the target when you flash to them, it will instantly go off. So you can use that to really surprise people, make it undodgeable. Now you do need to be careful that you don't flash out of the range, because if you do, say for example I press W here and I flash, you will just sit on the spot and not do anything. So for Sylas in lane, generally the early game is quite bad for you, especially if you're versus a ranged champion, but the kind of like longer the game goes on for, the better it gets for you. So, you know, when you're getting that like level 7, level 9, it's starting to get really, really good for you. So in this early game here, you're just wanting to, especially on the first few waves, play really safe. Try and get what CS you can and try and minimize the amount of damage that you take. So you can do this by just like queuing the creeps, although it does cost a lot of mana, so don't invest too much into it. Again, if the matchup is really difficult, you can look to start stuff like Doran's Shield, and as long as you don't fall behind in this stage of the game, you're honestly just in a really good spot. Like, I really want to re-emphasize that this very early game, especially 1 to 4, is Sylas's like biggest weak point. It's very similar to a champion like Ahri, where after that point, you're just so strong at trading, and where you're just like so hard to kill that you can basically do whatever you want. So if you can just let these first kind of early waves come to you, you know, you can look to set up ganks. You don't have to just like do nothing, but really try not to fall behind at this point in the game. I think that's like absolutely crucial. As you get a bit later in the lane and you get a bit stronger, you can start to look trading aggressively. You can see I'm going for some Q harass here. I'm looking to play aggressively into her. Just doesn't end up turning into anything, but you can see that at this point, you can really start pressuring your opponent. And even though you're a melee champion versus a ranged champion, you actually have like much better poke than a lot of them at some point. So once you get to this point, you're pretty safe to do whatever you want. And also you have enough wave clear with your Q to kind of push waves in a reasonable amount of time and start looking to ward river or roam or do stuff like that. Versing melee champions is very similar. A lot of melee champions are very strong, especially in the first few levels, so you should only look to short trade a lot of the time versus them. This is kind of when W max could be considered better, although I still think Q max is better now. At the time this replay is from, it was when Q max was not a thing, but I really still think Q max is quite good because you can poke people down and also you can punish their short wave clear. But it's just really crucial that when you play against these kind of melee champions, especially ones that have strong extended trades, that you don't trade on them for too long. You might want to just like poke them down with Q. You might want to try save your E to get out defensively. The one kind of nice thing you have going for you in these matchups is that you do have quite a lot of wave clear just because of your Q and also from your AoE auto attacks, and that's going to mean that you often have minion advantage, which is very important when you're versing melee champions because they will have to fight you with auto attacks, and just by having more creeps, the trades will often go in your favor. Again, just like the range matchups, when you're hitting like level 5, level 6, level 7 in these matchups, you can really start taking over. And you can still look to punish your opponent, obviously, if they make a mistake, like if they waste their cooldowns or whatever. But once again, just really make sure that you don't fall behind in this very early stage of the game. One of the most important things for Sylas' laning is your wave control. So if you haven't watched my laning guide, I would recommend checking out the melee versus range section. But it's very important that unless you're pushing the wave in order to roam somewhere, that you keep the wave on your side. And that's because you have really good gank setup. So it's easy for you to set up ganks onto your opponent. And also you will be able to kind of like chase them down if they make a mistake a lot easier. It's quite hard for you to actually poke them under tower. Even though your Q is like a good poking tool, it's much better if they're pushed up in the wave. So if in order to snowball, it's basically like you want to try set up ganks onto your opponent like this sort of clip where the wave is on your side. It makes it quite difficult for them to play. Or once you get a lot of points in Q, you can just look to spam push the wave, run into the river, and look to pick up kills from skirmishes. I also want to say say, don't be too greedy with your starting itemization on Sylas. While it's nice to go for the Doran's Ring and stuff like that, if you have Doran's Shield and Second Wind, it allows you to survive basically any matchup, and it just makes it so much more forgiving. And as I said before, like really the only time that you're very punishable as Sylas is in that very early game. So if you're in a matchup where you think you're going to get really hard punished early, or you're just like kind of new to Sylas, or even if you're like pretty experienced on Sylas, but you just want to make sure that your early game is consistently as smooth as possible, I would highly recommend that. I think it makes laning pretty easy mode even after the sustained nerfs. So like this game, for example, as you can see in the top right, I was playing on 180 ping, and even with that, I was able to survive this Vex's harass for long enough in order to set up a gank when this Master Yi came here, and we managed to get a kill. So just don't be too greedy with that. Make sure you get through that early game, no matter what. Teamfighting on Sylas, there's a couple really important things to keep in mind. The first thing is that because you're a cooldown-based champion, the longer you stay alive, it increases your value a lot. You're not a champion that can just blow all your cooldowns very early in the fight, and then die afterwards and it's fine. Like, no, you need to stay alive a long time, and the easiest way to do that as a melee champion is to wait for some of the key cooldowns to be used. So you can see here that the enemy team has used a lot of their cooldowns, and they don't really have anything left. So now it's very easy for me to re-engage. As Sylas, it's very rare that you want to be the first person engaging, and so you will most likely be wanting to either try find like a flank or just be kind of like a follow-up engage after someone else on your team goes. But it's very important that you kind of identify like what are the important cooldowns that you're waiting to be used, because if you go into an enemy team when they still have everything up, you'll probably just die instantly and you won't really get the chance to get like lots of rotations of cooldowns off. Another thing, obviously, to think about is just how you're going to use various ultimates. So because Sylas is a champion that steals ults, and a lot of those are combat ults, the ult you steal is going to change how you play the fight quite a lot. So you really need to think about how you're going to use the ult before you play the fight, because I think, especially if you're someone that's like sort of newer to the game and doesn't have an experience with lots of different ults, you might not have like an immediate idea of how you want to play the fight, but generally you'll just be wanting to use it to kind of assassinate squishy targets, to start an engage, something like that. As I said before, cooldowns are really important on Sylas. You need to think about the enemy team's cooldowns, but also respect your own cooldowns. So if you don't get bursted on the engage, it's very easy for you to keep fighting, and whenever your cooldowns are kind of down, they have a pretty short period that you can quickly kind of play away. So you can see here my Q and W are on cooldown. I just quickly like try and buy a little bit of time before re-engaging once my W is up. So that's kind of the key to these like really long fights as Sylas, is just rotating your cooldowns. If you don't get one shot, you will just be unkillable. That's the thing. You can just get cooldown off after cooldown, and don't be afraid to like take the time to let your cooldowns back up. So you can buy that with Flash, you can buy that with Zhonya's, you can buy that by just like positioning a bit further away, you know? Like as long as you can buy extra rotations of cooldowns, it's very, very hard for people to kill you. Obviously, if you fall behind as Sylas, teamfighting becomes a lot harder because it's just way easier for you to get one shot and you're not going to have the items you need in order to buy more time. And when that kind of situation happens, you need to get creative, and oftentimes that can be through stealing like a really key teamfight ultimate and changing it like that. So even though I'm honestly pretty useless in this fight, I'm able to get off a really big Renata ult, and also I'm still providing a lot of damage. And because of your extra sustain, you're actually a little tankier than you look. You can buy a little bit more time, and if you're behind and you die like this, this is completely fine. Sylas is not one of those champions where you need to have a really high KDA, but it really is important that you're not dying for no reason. If you can get in, deal a ton of damage, and die for that, that's completely worth it. This is Sylas' matchup tier list. Now, in the past, Sylas wasn't really a blind pick, and so what people would do was they would either counterpick Sylas into a matchup where they were going to get rather like free scaling, they weren't going to get punished too hard, or they would pick Sylas blind after having seen like good ultimates on the enemy team, because even if they lost lane, they could still scale into the game. Now, these days, with the kind of rise of Qmax, there's a lot of your matchups that used to be quite hard that are now quite neutralizable. So I'd say while Sylas wasn't really a blind pick before, he's quite strong right now, and also with Qmax, I think you can neutralize enough of these lanes to make Sylas a viable blind pick, and I think he is extremely strong in solo queue at the moment. I think the most difficult matchups are generally ones with extremely strong extended trades. So champions like this, you have a very hard time playing against in lane. They will just put you really far behind. That being said, even these champions here, they are quite gankable. You know, if they make a mistake, if you control your wave in the right way, you can make it difficult for them. And I wouldn't even say that these matchups like here are like undealable with. Like if you play well, you can survive. It's just naturally you're going to be behind. It is a counter pick matchup. I think if you ever get free scaling as Sylas, if you ever verse any of these matchups down here in the C or D tier, you are just going to absolutely 1v9 the game. Even if they don't have the best ultimates, you will just absolutely take over. If you can get 10 CS PM on Sylas, you will be unstoppable. You'll be just so hard to kill and you'll completely take over. Like, Sylas is really balanced around the fact that he should fall behind. Like, he naturally is sort of weak at laning. So if you're versus a champion that can't punish you for that, you can just completely take over. The champs that are more skill matchups are these ones in here. A lot of these really just depend on the player, and I think the higher you go, sometimes the harder they become, but also they really can just be influenced by the rest of the map. You know, there is a jungler, there is a support on the map as well. Sylas is extremely good at picking up kills and like random skirmishes, so if you can get involved in some early skirmishes, which generally you're much better than other champions in early skirmishes, like even if a champ like Orianna or Victor beats you in the 1v1, it's like if you just have a fight, you bring them into it, you will naturally win the fight. If you get some kills, it's very, very easy for you to snowball that lead from there. So this is the Sylas ultimate tier list. Now, I did not make this, and I also disagree with some of it, but I'm going to link it in the description below if you want to find it. Generally, the ults that are best on Sylas are like AoE teamfight ultimates or AoE engage ultimates. So stuff like Malphite R, Mumu R, Fiddlesticks are all amazing, and you will kind of find the things that tend to not be that great are a lot of the single target things. So stuff like Syndra ult is not that good. There are some down here that I would disagree with. Like, I actually think Zoe ult is fairly decent because it can allow you to hit a chain or hit a W with it, but just the ones you really want to be looking for are these ones up here. If you don't know every ultimate in the game, I think that's fine. Just aim to pick up like AoE teamfight ultimates or some engage ults, and those will almost always be the best. So guys, that is going to be it for my Sylas guide. You guys have been asking for this for a while. I got emails, I even got Instagram DMs of people asking me when is the Sylas guide coming, so I'm glad to have finally gotten it out. If you have any questions about anything in the video or anything else, just please feel free to leave them in the comment section below, and I will be happy to reply to them. Also, check out my socials and some of the playlists I have in the description below. Other than that, guys, if you liked the video, go ahead and like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.